Good morning, everyone. So I'm just going to launch right into the presentation. Motivated by an interest in the specific questions of sexual orientation, Ahmed offers an account of how bodies are orientated through the ways in which they take up space, time, and space. Throwing light on the concept of orientation in sexual orientation, Ahmed explains how we perceive our social worlds in relation to the proximity between body and objects through action and what that effects are when bodies are directed to particular spaces. Ahmed argues that bodies are shaped by what they tend towards, and that repetition of that tending towards produces certain tendencies. In this paper, I open up how school spaces acquire the shape of the bodies that inhabit them. To paraphrase Ahmed, when we describe institutions such as schools as straight spaces, we draw attention to how such spaces are shaped by the proximity of some bodies and not others. Cisgender and heterosexual bodies gather and cohere to form the edges of such places. Ahmed crystallizes how power operates as a mode of directionality in schools, that to become straight means that we have to turn towards the objects given to us through compulsory heterosexuality and cisnormativity. And we have to turn towards the objects given to us and turn away from the objects that take us off the straight line. These objects in schools are curricular practices, pedagogies, sport, social events, award ceremonies, and school rituals. To illustrate, think about heteronormative and cisnormative practices performed through the grade 12 dances, almost many heterosexual marriages. When we describe institutions such as schools as straight spaces, we draw attention to how orientations about the directions we take that put some things and not others within our reach. My deliberate and intentional use of portrait instead of landscape, oblique and monochrome images in this presentation, for example, force you not to see, read, or be straight, but to reorientate yourself to slant, to get within proximity. A querying, if you'd like, to force you to deviate from the straight line. To be orientated, therefore, is to follow the lines which direct us, to see slant and not straight. Ahmed hasn't written about schooling per se, but I draw on their phenomenological project to think about how cis-heteronormativity and schooling serve as a straightening device, ensuring that schools are orientated around the straight body. Explaining gender and sexuality is something we enact by desiring and becoming pulled towards other bodies. Social institutions such as schools make it seem like queer and trans bodies are not within reach. As a result, school spaces become straight, enabling straight bodies to extend into them. Repetitive performances of hegemonic asymmetrical gender identities and compulsory heterosexuality solidify over time that repetition, over time to produce the illusion that schools as institutions are cis-heteronormative spaces. Hence, the queer subject, the queer or trans subject within a straight schooling culture deviates and is made socially out of line or deviant. In this paper, I draw on a larger project on different forms of data that have been drawn up through interviews, observations, analysis of content in textbooks. The data from school managers, teachers, learners, and textbooks will show how schools produce a field of cis-heteronormativity, cis-heteronormative sub-objects, and position heterosexuality and cisgenderism as normative and ideal. In fact, a happy destination. So I present very quickly on the ethnography. It's in two phases. It's the kind of ethnography that grounded the book that I just recently published. Phase one was looking at queer activism in South Africa, and it was an analysis of all their online programs, all reports, etc., which is a two-year discursive analysis of these policy documents, etc. And then the second phase was speaking to queer or trans activists in South Africa, secondary school teachers, managers, 31 school-attending youth. Of those, 18 were queer or trans, 7 were trans or non-binary youth, and of course 11 straight youth. So I'm going to go to data and offer a kind of analysis of some of the findings in the paper. The following account by Julie, so there's 3 findings that I'm going to discuss today, using Ahmed's directionality: 1, to turn away, to be out of view, and to turn within. So if you can follow me on those 3 findings through the presentation. So the following account by Julie, a 17-year-old white bisexual girl attending a private school in Durban, South Africa, underscores what happens when one turns away from the straight line given to us by compulsory heterosexuality culture. Julie's narrative, and I won't read that, you can kind of scan through that, crystallizes how power of heterosexuality is institutionalized in schools. Taken how some same-sex relations are constructed as unhealthy, weird, corrupted, and a social problem. Notice also how Julie's mom's anticipated response followed the school's line, that straight line, putting some objects and not others in reach, with the same requirement that Julie gives up the possibility of same-sex attraction. Reflecting on Julie's narrative, I'm struck by the repeated reference to how queer bodies are diverted away from each other, which affects how they are positioned in school spaces. The metaphor captures how queer bodies leak into worlds, a way of orientating the body towards and away from others, which affects how one can enter different kinds of social spaces. The right path and direction in Julie's school context is solidified by the principal later in the interview, where Julie speaks about the principal reprimanding her and saying, "You are not allowed on the grade 9 floor. You've got one pathway to your room and to the bathroom, and that's where you can go." The objects in her line is heterosexuality. For Julie, inhabiting the queer slant is a matter of everyday negotiation. Notice the anxiety. The principal's intervention in pointing Julie in a specific direction rather than others served to straighten up anything queer or out of line. I'm going to move to Louise, an 18-year-old white lesbian learner's decision to come out and into the homophobic attitudes in some schooling, and how difficult it seems for queer youth to come out. Now notice Julie comes out and notices she uses, "I want to check the waters out," and she announces herself coming out as bisexual. And then this is the class response to that. Notice the highlights. "You can't be bisexual. It's just a phase. It's something you will just grow out. That's not the path. That's not the line." Notice again, the other idea, stigmatizing and letting you know you're on the wrong path. You've just got sex with every guy. And then I thought to myself, whoa, do I need this bent line or the slant in my life? Notice the kind of regulation and the policing. This is very much in line with the literature, which informs us how hard it is for queer youth to come out at some schools. Cultures of compulsory cis-normativity or cis-heteronormativity are rife in schools, and the findings draw attention to how queer and trans subject positions in schools are made untouchable or out of reach. Rather than efforts to create curricula and school environments that foster gender and sexuality diversity, queer and trans subject positions are put out of view. Boosie, an African 17-year-old lesbian attending an ex-Model C school in Gauteng, tells how a teacher instructed them to remove any reference to LGBTQ self-acceptance and pride. Notice, the Christian badges are large, but she has to remove the pride celebratory. It is not only that schools prescribe following a compulsory cis-heteronormative script, it's also that queer and trans youth have to refuse or turn away from scripts that take them off the straight path. In Louise and Julie's case, they have to deny the existence of their queer identities and not seem wayward or out of line. To be counter-normative or to go against the conventions of cis-heteronormativity, as is evident in Louise and Julie's narratives, highlights the deviation from the path and turning away from what is right, good, and proper. To paraphrase Ahmed, to become straight means that one has to turn towards objects given to us by the cis-heteronormative culture and turn away from objects that take us away from that path. Gina, an 18-year-old African woman, learned from an ex-Model C school, and part of a focus group discussion crystallizes this. Gina's slide is now up. Okay, there's Gina. And Gina says, notice this word. If anybody comes out of the school, did come out, the school would squash it. And you can be any more powerful in resonating how this is kind of suppressed. Queer and trans learners who are oppositional to the compulsory cis-heteronormativity in schools may not even get near enough as possible objects to be directed towards. I'm going to move to the next theme, to be out of view. The invisibility of LGBTIQ, to be out of view is to be invisible or to be silenced, is a recurring theme in gender and sexuality diversity in schooling. Scan the following transcript by Lerato, a mathematics teacher or a township outside Johannesburg. Okay, so that slide is not up. I'm going to move in another interview. I think I've got that. Okay, in this township, there we go. In another interview with Anne, a teacher at an ex-model school, notes that there is no need to teach about gender and sexuality diversity in the curriculum at her school because it's not relevant to the learners there, also suggesting that LGBTQ learners at her school. There's no LGBTQ learners at her school. She continues, I suppose if we had gay learners here, perhaps, but we don't. Both Lerato and Anne's response is troubling because it suggests that there is no queer or gender diverse youth present. There's no need for content related to gender and sexuality diversity to be taught. This is an economy of practices at work here, where queer and trans erasure reproduces this heteronormativity, which in fact harms all learners. It is particularly unjust to young people questioning their gender or sexuality, their sexual identities. To erase gender and sexuality diversity in the curriculum, therefore, reinforces the normalcy of cis-heteronormativity. Despite data indicating that individuals who self-identify as queer or gender diverse represent a sizable and increasing proportion in South Africa, with more school-attending youth openly identifying as queer or transgender and at younger ages, how schools have responded to their visibility and integration remains mostly unexplored. Yet both Lerato and Anne's arguments that there are no queer or trans learners at their school dismiss the need to address gender and sexuality diversity. This is remarkable when it's unquestioned and taken for granted. What is equally disconcerting and troubling is the assumption that, in fact, if there are no queer and trans learners at the school, then straight learners will not see the need for a curriculum beyond compulsory cis-heteronormativity. The next is a harrowing slide, so it's a trigger alert. This appears in a textbook in South Africa. It's a grade 10 textbook in life orientation, where the course of gender and sexualities is taught. The instruction, the unit also asks learners to read and then role-play the scenario so that everyone can watch and contribute. This is a story about a girl, Precious, who asks a guy to tell a guy that she's not interested in him, but she's interested in another girl. At a party later on, Precious is raped by that guy and a number of other boys. Now, this had to be role-played in the school. That's the instruction. Now, can you imagine this repetition of instilling a kind of fear thing? If you go off the path, this is the consequence for you. Indeed, such visibility becomes one way to attribute blame, fuel ignorance, and deepen stereotypes about people who are LGBTQ, When queer and trans youth represent or are visible, they are done so in a context of violence and stigmatization to maintain gender and sexuality within the boundaries of cultural heteronormativity. Thank you. Not only does this position of queer and trans young people is out of line and need of correction and civilization in a way, but it also justifies them of being targets of bullying, violence, and even rape. These discourses of invisibility and erasure that circulate within the classrooms are part of and reinforce the cis-heteronormative ideologies, cultures, and social norms of the broader society. Because I've got 5 minutes, I'm going to push ahead to the last theme, if that's all right. I want to show this. This was a headline in our newspaper. A transgender teen set to become the first to join an all-girls school. This is a wonderful, welcome kind of thread, in our newspapers, a transgender. At the time of the data collection of this book, a newspaper headline, transgender teen set to become first to join an all-girls government school, caught my attention. The article describes a 14-year-old who has been at a boys' school since grade 1, was set to become the first transgender. While the news is indeed welcome, it also works to create an impression that there are no gender diverse or trans youth in South African schools, which I encountered 11 others in the data collection. Notice the invisibilizing or moving of the path. They don't exist. Now, interestingly, in an interview with the principal later on, this is his remark. Notice how that article becomes a citational thread through saying, oh, we're talking about 1 or 2 learners, and I'm not sure schools need to go into such a frenzy mode. Notice how he's referencing the article, right? Notice how he invokes we, as in we, in a kind of, we're all so committed to a social justice arena. We can't go into a frenzy. I'm on your side, but he's not. I'm going to go to my last theme, and this is where I round up, to turn within. So what does this all mean? And Ahmed doesn't go to turn within. This is where I go and extend this work in a little way. Being out of line for queer youth and transgender diverse youth is a state of disorientation. In this regard, Ahmed asks an important question as to what effects such encounters have on the bodies of others who become transformed into objects of hate. In what follows, I unpack what it means to be out of line. And here is what it means for bodies that are pushed out of line. And there are 2 particular narratives I want to share here with you. The one is by Lwando, who tells how worthless he felt during physical education. Notice the one, it is a sick feeling of worthlessness in my stomach, that sense of angst that he talks about. In the other one, and the other students there, it's Jeffrey, an 18-year-old colored boy. He talks about those cruel voices of Macy. Notice Macy is in Afrikaans a small girl, not even a woman or a girl. This is an 18-year-old boy, a person. When I asked Jeffrey whether he reported these incidents to anyone, he responded, "Who would believe me?" And this was a particular moment in the data. Who would believe me? Because me, I'm just a moffie. And the moffie is a derogative term for somebody who's gay in South Africa. And he minimizes it. I am just a moffie. Who would believe me? And notice how it's internalized. And here I'm going to wrap up. The conclusion, and I showed you how to be queer or to move away from the cis-heteronormative line, to turn away, to be out of view, to turn within. Ahmed's work directs us. She does direct us to understand how cis-heteronorms orientate school-attending queer and trans youth to face a certain way, and that is the straight towards a future where norms appear as strikingly palpable things. As compulsory cis-heteronormative spaces, schools our queer and trans learners learn their place, which is one of exclusion and marginalization. Thank you. And this is the book on where I use the work of Ahmed's work on queer phenomenology and the cultural politics of emotion to kind of think through queer activism. Yes.
Hi, thank you for that presentation. It was really interesting. I wonder, do you think there are resources within Ahmed's work for disrupting some of this in a way that draws on that idea of slant or other kinds of resources that are there present in her work? I'm just wondering.
Yeah.
Or if not, are there other ways that you've kind of noticed within this space of disruption? You've presented a really kind of hard to hear picture here, but I wonder are there spaces of hope within this?
Sure. Great. Do I take just a question by question, or there's another question in the back? Great.
Thanks, Dennis. That was really fascinating. So could I just build on the first question and ask how you're working with the notion of activism in the book?
Right. All right. Good stuff. Thank you. Can I go with those two questions? Oh, can I go with that too? There's a mouthful, and then I would. Yes, I kind of think, when you're doing a book of 70,000 words, and you want to touch all the touch points of where's intersectionality, where's the agency, and where's the queer joy, and of course those are in the book, right? And I talk to that. This particular paper is what do we know up to now in South Africa, and I wanted to track that, and I wanted to present this. So what Ahmed offers us, and remember, I make that very clear. Ahmed doesn't talk about schooling per se. He hasn't written about schooling. Ahmed is a philosopher talking about space and bodies and emotion, and other things too. So I use Ahmed as a way to remove from the one kind of dimensionality of what happens to queer and trans youth. And that's it. And in some ways, I'm guilty of that, and I do that today. And the idea is to set you up to ask me the question about, okay, what is that queer joy? What is the kind of pushback? And there is. And the book is talking about queer activism. It comes from my previous book about writing about gender and sexuality diversity in South Africa, looking at policy and curriculum. And at the end of that book, I come to the conclusion that if we are to believe that answers within schools are going to be found, then we become the believers of impossibility. Within South African schools, there is no take-up to addressing these issues. And that's our problem around teacher education, that's our problems around who's in our system of professional development and all of that stuff that's going to come in. Of course, our cultural heteronormativity, which is deeply rooted in South African. This book was called Queer Activism. And I wanted to, in my last book, I left up, and I kind of flagged, and I said, maybe we should be looking at these queer organizations, these NGO organizations that do powerful work around raising awareness about homophobia and transphobia, and coming up with a couple of strategies. So Ahmed doesn't offer us that route. Ahmed names how space is around the straight body, the white body. Okay. So I use Ahmed's work in that way. What I add to this is how queer activism in South Africa, and so when I started this data, I went to the schools and talking to principals and teachers. Then I went to the queer activists and was listening to some of their work. And then I went back to a couple of young people in schools and teachers. And it kind of moved me from the romanticized idea that the answers will only be from queer activism. So I found pockets of some excellent work within schools. And there's one chapter where I talk about these kind of agents of change or these kind of allies who are in schools. And there were some really interesting pockets of people using, addressing pronouns in a fairly aggressive way in some schools. Schools that were more resourced were kind of more evolved around thinking about gender and sexuality diversity. So Ahmed per se didn't offer that, a kind of way and say, okay, this exists to kick back. But Ahmed does point us into the collective. Ahmed does point us to that lovely presentation yesterday by one of the people who spoke about Wenger's communities of practice. And so I found Ahmed points us into that direction, but not explicitly so. Karen, the question around activism, the work around queer activism in South Africa is phenomenal. At the levels where South Africa actually has the most progressive legislation in the world around gender and sexuality diversity. There isn't a country that can compete. In fact, South Africa was the first country to have in its constitution that nobody will be discriminated on the basis of sexual orientation. The social realities are not there. But our policy framework, our legislation in terms of adoption, marriage rights, all of that is there, and we peg up fairly significantly. The work is in education, and that comes in an inherited system of colonialism, of apartheid, that has still deep roots, that Christian hegemony still exists within South Africa in powerful and straight ways that address this. But the queer activists are the people that have actually changed our legislative framework. The kind of activism, when you talk about the data, I mean, talking to activists, was particularly interesting. And I asked, when are the times that you actually engage with schools? And I mean, you got queer activists, is when the shit hits the fan. That's when schools will call us in. Or, fairly colorful language of saying the only time we call in is when this happens. Schools, from the whole research, still felt very, very much on avoiding. So queer activists were not in their line of schooling. Yeah. Okay, great, thank you.
Right, in many ways I may be touching on similar themes here. This is a study based in some local schools to where I work, and we got the title from one of the interviews we did where one of the students we spoke to recollected an occasion where she was told she wasn't real, okay, by other students. And so that's where we came up with this notion that we're looking at identity and how identity is impacted by the school climate and the school culture, and trying to make sense of that. Is it supposed to move forward? Okay, so the context, it builds on a study I did previously with a couple of colleagues where we'd noticed there was a disconnect between the teachers and the LGBT students in terms of climate and culture. And we picked out there's a lot of discrimination from peers. So what we wanted to do was to explore much more about how LGBTQ students experience school, but also how their peers thought they experienced the school. So we're trying to explore those sorts of issues there. Okay. And we're taking the notion of climate and culture. We're taking the idea from Payne and Smith, who talk about the climate is that overall day-to-day level of interaction, how you get on with other people. And the notion of culture is much more the underpinning norms and assumptions which permeate through the institution. As we will go through, you'll see they do get a bit blurry at times, so it's not a neat distinction, but it's sort of like a working one we've used there. Okay. But what Payne and Smith talk about is the need to look at both climate and culture. A lot of the research we've looked at does tend to focus on the climate, and there's an excessive focus on bullying. Okay? And I do quite like this quote from Payne and Smith talk about, niceness cannot erase the stigma. It's actually not about just asking people to be nice to people. It's actually, there needs to be something a bit more fundamental than that. So we need to look much more at the culture and what's going on in terms of school cultures. Because even though the climate might be okay, the underlying culture might be quite negative there. And as we see, one of the things we'd notice, and we're sort of unpicking at the moment, is this notion that actually what's the difference between climate and culture? We think there's something to do about persistence and pervasiveness of actions and the way things happen. Okay. So just a quick summary, just some of the literature around LGBTQ plus youth experiences in schools. There was a sudden explosion of literature which talks about the positivity happening. Okay? And that's great, and that's to be welcomed. Looking at it, most of it seems to be about homosexual males or bisexual males. And one of the things we picked up from the previous study is actually there are more acceptable ways of being LGBTQ plus than others. Okay, and so I remember one of the students we spoke to says, I'm okay, I'm white, middle class and gay, that's acceptable. Okay. Some of the grey literature presents a much more negative picture, okay? But also a lot of the other academic literature talks about the fact that these youngsters are bullied, they're victimised, they're more likely to self-harm, and this, that and the other. Okay? So there are some serious issues there, and I think in the current climate as well, there's a lot more issues facing trans and non-binary students as well. Yeah. And alongside that, we've also been looking at the notion of identity, and actually what we're after is some sort of like cohesive, stable sense of self. Okay? And whether or not that comes from within or that's impacted by other factors outside of you, there does seem to be moved towards a much more socially cultural constructed model of that. Okay? But also actually LGBTQ plus identities are often perceived as a story of struggle and survival. Okay, and actually, without going through that, are you an authentic person? But they're often linked around this notion of stigma, minority stress, aggressions, and things like that. Okay, but also, Kohler and Hammett also, there are stories of emancipation, sort of like very positive stories there. So we're trying to find out what was happening there. Okay. So what we were looking at in particular was the extent to which school culture and school climate actually affirmed LGBTQ plus student sense of self, okay, or was that actually an assault on what they were doing? And actually how our school culture and climate is different, okay? A subsidiary thing, we're trying to unpick a bit more about the difference between culture and climate, and we're also trying to develop a tool to allow us to capture that, okay? So we're in the process of doing that as well. So this study was a mixed methods. It was a year-long study. I'm going to mainly focus on the qualitative elements, and I'll throw in some of the quantitative stuff. If you have any questions about statistics, please don't ask me. That's my colleague, Annie, who's the expert on that. But I carried out the focus group interviews with the students, and then so we did a survey of the wider student body. Okay? And just to give you a bit of context, okay, those are the schools we went to. Just say at the bottom, Elm School is slightly different. We didn't get the surveys from them. Despite repeated askings, we had the focus group but not the surveys. But also, interestingly, they're a boys' school. And I interviewed some trans girls within that boys' school, and actually we're exploring their experiences there. Okay? But we've got 5 other schools. In many ways, fairly typical, but actually we've got high levels of English additional language in them, and some schools, they do very significantly in terms of free school meals as well. Okay? In terms of how the surveys, you can see the number of students we got who said they weren't LGBT, the number who were questioning, and somebody who were affirmative that they were. Interestingly, around a quarter of students were either questioning or have come out as LGBTQ+. So actually, I thought that in itself was interesting. And you got the range of year groups there. So year 8s are 12 and 13, and 13, 14, 14, 15-year-olds. So we've got slightly different set of responses from different schools. And in terms of the focus groups, they varied in size from 3 to 7. And in terms of identities, we've got a big, broad range of identities there. In terms of the analysis, in terms of the coding we've got there, what we've got in black about the challenges to identity, those seem to be sort of like the negative things coming out, and I'll talk about those in a minute. And we've noticed some of them much more to do with climate, some a bit more to do with culture. Then we've got ignorance, and then in the blue, we've got the more positive side, the agentic side of what these adolescents were able to do, and also what external support they've got there. And in the survey, we've got some climate stuff and also culture stuff, and I'll quickly talk to you through those. Okay? So generally, we talk about identity. We felt that there were significant attacks on how these people wanted to present or wanted to be. Okay? Some of them were direct attacks, and some of them were indirect attacks. Okay? And in terms of what we've got lots of challenges from peers, and that's largely seen as climate unless it's massively pervasive. Also from teachers. Again, if at an individual level we're seeing that as very much as climate, but if it's much more persistent, it seems to be a much more cultural thing. And also challenges from the school. And there's notions about struggle for normalisation and ignorance as well. Okay. So if we just look at some of the statistical data quickly, we see in terms of school climate, some of the things we're looking at there, we do have significant differences between the schools. Okay. Here we've got Maple and Willow, and you can see with Maple School has a much more negative experience for youngsters compared to Willow School. Okay? If we go and look at how individuals related to peers, again, there are statistically significant differences between the schools we looked at. And also in terms about adults and how adults related to people, again, statistically significant difference there. So some schools are doing a better job than others. Okay? What we also did is we actually analysed it quickly between those students who identified as LGBTQ+, those who were unsure and those who didn't. And again, we've got similar sort of things. Okay? School climate is significantly different. In terms of relation to peers, significantly different. Okay? In terms of adults caring about me, that wasn't significantly different. So we're trying to puzzle out whether or not that's a good thing or if it's just an anomaly in the data. Okay? But when we go and look at the focus groups, we get a similar sort of picture to the data. Willow and Maple schools very much were at the bottom and the top in focus groups and this sort of like in the survey. The others are a bit more all over the place, so we're still working on that. But generally, when we're talking about challenges from peers, we're getting these things like outcasting. So Willow School was the most positive, but they're still experiencing issues about being regarded as being sinful for what they're doing, lots of jokes about being gay. Okay? When we go into Maple School, we've got a lot more challenging behaviours there. So we've got one student actually came out and had to move class because her entire class rejected her. So she was forced to move. Okay, one of the kids was told they were going to be converted. And somebody said, "I know where you live. I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to follow you home and hurt you." Okay. Similarly, we're talking about Ash School. We've got one of the issues particularly found with trans students. If they transition during school, they're more likely to be victimised because they've been seen as the before and after, so that therefore they're more obvious and open. Other students talk about being harassed daily, slurs being called at them. Sycamore School down the end, that's actually one of the more painful focus groups to conduct because of the issues they were facing. So there was this one trans student talked about being followed home from school and being surrounded and having objects thrown at him. Okay? And another student spoke about actually having a bad day at school and ended up in hospital because the implication of attempted suicide. Okay? If we go and look at the relationships with staff, again, Elm, Oak and Willow come out quite well. The others come out less well in the focus groups. Okay? And if we look at here, there's this notion that teachers don't care. They don't care who you are. Okay? Ash School in particular, there was a lot of obvious attacks. That one teacher was reported as saying, gay people are weird, trans people are weird, to a trans student. Okay? Talking about getting abuse from teachers, and one of the teachers saying, "I know your dead name, I'm going to use it because I can," and using that position of power to sort of like diminish that sense of identity. Okay? But also, issues around, teachers seeing things, not doing anything about it, refusing to use the correct pronouns. And again, with Sycamore School, this notion here, actually, the teacher actively trying to prove that the student was wrong. You can't be trans. Okay? So there's some worrying concerns there. Okay? If we start to look at a bit more of the culture side of things, the survey didn't pick this up so well, but there were significant differences when we're talking about the curriculum. Okay? And that is also true when we talk about the students who identify as LGBTQ or not. Okay? But when we start to go and look at the schools, again, the curriculum doesn't come out very positive. It's only, again, Elm and Willow which come out fairly well. And interestingly, both of those are grammar schools, so I don't know if it's something to do with the nature of the schools there. Okay? But what we've got is that, and I think this is fairly typical of previous stuff I've looked at, in terms of the curriculum doesn't really favour LGBTQ+ issues. Okay? A lot of the students complain about PSHE or sex education, okay, and being heteronormative and cisgendered, okay, and what they often get is sort of like negative stereotypes about LGBTQ+ people. So, for example, if they come across it in context of history, it's usually in the context of Nazi persecution. So just that notion of victimhood there. Uniform didn't come out as too big an issue, which I've come across previously, but in Sycamore School, the uniform was very gendered. So blazers were cut to different, to the female shape, PE uniforms were cut to the female shape, that sort of thing. So that wasn't considered that wasn't necessarily helpful there. And also again with gendered spaces, the notion actually of access. You know, the teachers have provide the access to things, and pupils don't necessarily have ready access to things. You have to go and ask for the key to get the damn toilets unlocked. Okay. So what you find is students just hang on and hang on and hang on until they've got access. Okay. And that has knock-on effects. If they end up being in spaces a long way from their peers, it takes them long to get things, so they end up being late, getting into trouble, and so it just gets into a negative cycle there. And we also got this thing about the behavioural policies. So, you know, I thought it was a very perceptive comment what the student in Ash School talked about. It's a very performative system. Teachers perform the behaviour policy. They do it, but nothing happens. You know, kids then abscond from the detentions and things, and nothing ever happens. Okay, teachers just walk by, or you know, teacher will observe something. Oh, I'll just put it on Sims and don't do anything initially there and then to deal with that. Okay, and we've got issues here. Again, Sycamore School was quite a startling place to go to in some way. This idea, I had to asked for months and months and months of being harassed in the classroom in order to be moved because the teacher wouldn't move me. Okay? And also there's a lack of role models, coming back to the issue of visibility. Okay? I have in the previous study, there's one school I came across where lots and lots of staff are out, and it just made a massive difference. What we've got here is that when you ask the children, do you know anybody who's out? Very, very few of them are aware of any staff who are out. Okay? Generally, if we start some of the other issues we've got here, one of the teachers, thank you, one of the schools spoke about a teacher who displayed a pride flag in her classroom and got reprimanded and got told to take it down. Okay. There's LGBT History Month presentations to be circulated around the school, which teachers choose not to use. Seating plans are boy-girl, so there's a definite gender binary going on there. Dead naming on school systems. Okay? In Maple School, a lot of the issues stemmed from the fact that students tried to do what they did an assembly on about LGBTQ plus issues, which led to sort of like some quite difficult moments at that moment and thereafter. Okay? Also, the other thing which is interesting, a lot of the groups the students belong to are not advertised, they're secret. They're by invitation only, by word of mouth, okay? And again, this notion of teachers being the gatekeepers. If you want to do something, you have to get permission to do something for LGBTQ month, okay? And when we talk about normalisation, the students in Willow School, most people I spoke to in the focus group were identified as female, but they spoke about the problem of boys coming out, and actually them facing particular difficulties in their context. And then in Elm School, there was a real sense that the head teacher was the block to change. The trans student I was talking about, I was recounting a story of a previous trans student who'd led the changes in the school, forced the changes through despite a lot of obstacles, but ended up having to sort of like leave the school with mental health problems. Whether they were associated with the school, I don't know, but the school clearly didn't help. And the thing which caused great amusement amongst the focus group at Elm School is that one of the school slogans was creating good men. That was sort of like the underpinning thing. And they all found that very funny because it didn't apply to most of them in terms of they weren't the good men as the school would understand. Okay? And there's a whole series of issues around ignorance. Okay? They felt teachers were ignorant, peers were ignorant, there's a need for these people to be educated, and actually there's a need for that to be much more pervasive through the school culture in order for things to happen. Okay? So we've got a whole load of issues. Some teachers are aware, but actually they're talking about other teachers having very turfy views and things like that. Okay? There were some ways in which students could help themselves. So actually there was a sense of the agentic self. What we've got here is at one level they're supporting each other as a group. We stand up for each other, we're our own support group, we're our own little happy family. So that's quite positive in developing a sense of self. Students could also resist or avoid. So similar to what you were saying, there was an issue about badges, and the children would choose when to wear a badge and when not to display a badge, depending on how safe they felt there. They missed lessons. They sort of like deliberately choose where is it safe to go to and where it's not safe to go to, so they will abscond or miss school altogether. Okay? PE, a lot of them avoid PE, and so there's those sorts of things. Okay? So there's a level of what they can do about it, but it's actually, in some ways, illustrates the limitations on their power. Okay? There's also issues about selective disclosure, who they're going to be out to. Okay? And I think disclosure is always an interesting and challenging thing for people. But also, one of the things which did strike us is the fact that the groups they will belong to are often secret. Okay? It's not openly publicised in the school that this group exists, and that is out of fear that they will be picked on, or there'll be homophobic bullying with things, or homophobes will try to join the group, something like that. So there are issues about that. Okay? Obviously, they find the groups helpful, but also the fact that the secret is not massively encouraging. They do educate others, so they do get involved in sort of like creating lessons, okay? And so that's one way in which they can be seen to be helping themselves, okay? But when we talk about other things, they do support the community. Some of them have done fundraising. That seems to be very powerful. That's sort of like being quite a joyous element there, okay? And then we go to look at the external support, from teachers for the school or their peers. This is a lot thinner. Okay, I had loads and loads of stuff about the negativities, but there are things. There are some supportive teachers. Okay, they are idolised quite seriously by these students, but there's not many of them. Okay, if you go to the curriculum, there are some examples of good practice, but it's not pervasive. Okay, there are some role models, but there are not many role models. Okay, I love this example from Willow School, that when one of the kids suddenly, their peers realised that they were identifying differently and wanted to use different pronouns, they started to use the different French, masculine and feminine sort of thing, just to start talking to them like that, which they thought was absolutely beautiful, and I thought it was a wonderful example. Okay. So what we're trying to sense of is actually, if we talk about identity and becoming yourself and being allowed to be yourself, there's this thing about you've got your own internal struggle going on anyhow, your own internal sort of questioning. You've got this agentic self which can act in some ways as a buffer, what's going on, but also there's the issue about the culture and the climate in the school and the way that operates. And what we're seeing in many schools, it's the lack of a positive culture, the lack of a positive climate, which is actually making life really hard for these students. Okay, we want to sort of like get more on the supportive side, and that's what we're ideally we want to develop there. Okay, so culture we find is largely negative, and sometimes that does get reflected in terms of the climate as well. Okay, the culture reflects a very strong binary. Okay, there's a culture of invisibility in the curriculum role models. Okay, and there's a culture of not caring in all sorts of different ways. Okay, and just finding that culture and climate don't always align. So Willow School, very positive climate. Culture's quite good, but not as good as it could be. Elm School, very positive climate, but the culture is very, very heteronormative and cisgendered there. Okay, so there are positives, but also there's a lot of things to do. Okay, and so we're doing some work. I've been doing another project looking at interventions in primary school and actually how we can develop and change attitudes there and what's going on there in order to feed into secondary school. Okay, but we're also sort of like continue to develop a survey to see what we can do there. And my colleague, who's from the University of Barcelona, is sort of like going to be doing a large-scale study in Catalonia and see where we go from there. Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I want to ask about the cultural differences. I think it's very interesting. You're working with someone from Spain, and I understand they have a very different vision also of sexuality and alternative LGBT ways of seeing people. So I wonder if in the interpretation you were having this dialogue about the different ways in which we see this diversity. and what those differences may have been?
We haven't got to that stage yet. We're working on that. We have actually come across a paper recently which is looking at the differences between European nations and how LGBT issues are sort of like ranked there. And actually the UK and Spain came out as fairly similar on that. So we're going to be looking at that. So what our intention is, at some stage we want to do a sort of like a bigger study comparing what's going on in schools in Annie's location and in my location, and whether or not there are particular differences. Because one of the things that we're interested in is actually what makes a difference. Okay, what is it about school which makes a difference? What is it about the climate or the culture which makes a difference? Which is why in some ways the project I've just been doing in the primary school is a very, very small project in just one primary school. It's to do with, in some ways, secondary school's too late. You know, a lot of the kids I've spoken to are questioning their identities, you know, from the age of 5, 8, 9, whatever, and actually don't come out until they're 12 or 13. It's something that you've got this massive period of 4 or 5 years where you're sort of like stewing in your own issues, not able to talk to people about things. So, yeah, so we want to identify much more strongly what works and whether or not there are any cultural differences. But as I say, I was quite interested in the fact that with Dennis's talk, you know, South Africa, some of the issues seem to be very, very similar. And so actually that'd be interesting to explore that further as to how that pans out.
Thank you very much. This is a wonderful presentation. So I want to ask something like, because I feel like I can see this kind of like a tension between like a children and teachers and a school. I just wonder, for example, in a focus group, did you hear something like they mentioned something like parents? Like, is there any like a role played by parents in this kind of like a tension?
Yeah, we were mainly focused on schools, but we did ask whether or not they're out at home. And in the vast number of cases, the students we spoke to were out at home. Okay, in the cases where they weren't, in most of those, it was actually to do with religious issues at home and sort of like acceptance within the religious culture. So that's part of that external stuff. But actually, our focus was very much what was going on in the schools. But that was something we should come through. Yeah.
Hi, I work in this area in primary schools, and there was a time where I was incredibly positive about things, particularly when the Standard 7 looked at the requirement to tackle homophobic and other forms of discriminatory bullying. And for a while in the primary schools where I worked, it was taken as seriously as race incidents, and there was a legal requirement to report on instances of abuse in the LGBTQ plus arena. And so I just wondered, in light of Suella Braverman's recent speech and and moving forwards in that direction, how do you see this playing out in secondary school? Because it feels like perhaps things have lost the traction that they once had, 5-10 years ago. I'm
not sure. It's difficult to know because to get 6 schools, I had to approach 100 to be involved in the project. Okay, so I don't know if that is a sign of we don't care or we're too busy. The schools I've been to, the teachers who are the liaison people we used to get into the schools are very, very positive about it. But in some of them, they feel like they're swimming against the tide. Okay, and some of them it's very positive. The teachers can drive things further forward and this, that, and the other. So I'm not sure is the answer there. My feeling is there are enough good people out there who want to do good things. And I train teachers, and so actually on Friday we're doing this sort of like talk about these sorts of issues to our cohort. So I think there's an appetite to know more from what I've picked up, but I don't know how pervasive that is across the number of schools we work with. As I say, it's because the previous study we did, again, we had to approach about 100 schools to get 6 to take part. Okay, so I don't know if that's just indicative of priorities for schools at the moment.
Yeah, I was just thinking that I used to find it useful to have the legislation.
Yeah.
So I'd go in from a consultative point of view and say, you know, this is what you should be doing, these are the reasons why. And then if I met resistance, it was useful to have that legislative backup to say, well, actually, it's a requirement, you need to do this.
Yeah.
But I just wonder if there's like a rolling back of that sort of thing.
I get that, but I also think that the public discourse around it is actually, particularly towards trans and non-binary students, is actually very, very negative at the moment. So I think that doesn't help with matters.
Thank you.